and we'll just have it regular at 14 points. I'm not sure what the letter spacing I used was. 0. So I'll just correct this color, copy, and paste like so. Okay, so removing our guides now shows us we have our name perfectly clearly. Shunt that on a couple of pixels to line it up. So we have one input, very good, and now we'll add an additional input by copying that. That's going to be for the email. So we'll drag that down slightly. Up it goes. And we'll edit this text here. Email. Now lastly, we want a message input, a text area. So we'll drag that down to there, bring up our guides again, so that matches the bottom of our other one. Okay, now this would suggest to me that my inputs are way too large here. If I just, yes, if I go to the actual pixels, you see these are unnecessarily big, because I would like this message really to be larger. So I'm going to make this considerably smaller. So if I pick my direct selection tool and select the two bottom nodes on my shape here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 pixels higher. And then I do exactly the same for my email input. Like so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Now I'll shunt this whole input upwards, and the same with my message input, so that the labels are more or less horizontally centered there. That's going to be our message folder. Don't want that, like so. Alright. Okay, now we'll just make this a touch larger. There we go. Okay, so that's fairly clear. Now we're going to need a submit button, so I'd like that actually to be down here. We'll base it on a circle, such as the call to action above. I'm going to have it align with our contact information here. So we'll begin with this with an ellipse, and we'll just plonk that. Actually, we'll centralize it with that call to action above there. That's probably quite neat. We'll make it green, and we're going to put it in its own folder, which we'll call submit. Okay, we'll make it a little bit larger. Oh, we've added an effect as well, so we'll remove layer style because we don't want that drop shadow on that one. There we go. Centered on that gutter. And now we need a little label, so we'll just put send. We're going to use our droid serif, like so. That will be italic and 12 pixels and white, and then I will just center those two like so. Okay, so that's a fairly clear button as well. See how we're looking there. Okay, and there's one more thing we need. We need to consider the fact that our form information is going to have to be validated. We need the email, for example, to be a valid email address, and we need to make sure that the name is entered, so that's going to be a required field. So we need to cater for our validation messages, and we'll do that by adding a second text element here, and I'm going to align it to the right and then drag it over to nearly the end there. I'd like it to be according to our red. That's maybe a little strong. Actually, I think I'm going to make it equal to our slightly paler red there, slightly less aggressive. Now that's going to be another droid serif italic, and I'm going to put something along the lines of, please enter a valid email address. It's perfectly clear. Now this shadow will alter that color as well to highlight our field, so that the user knows that this field requires further attention. So that's what our invalid fields are going to look like. I'd like that to be a little clearer, so I'm going to use 14 pixel font instead of the 12. But that kind of sorts it out. Now again, as I said, we can do some further designing and touching up in the browser itself. We've got a basic idea of what our form is going to look like. This deals with pretty much everything we need, but we can tinker with it later on. Okay, we're going to Command and S, save that as it is. That's starting to look like quite a convincing landing page, don't you think? Okay, it's time for some further reading. We're going to jump back into our presentation as ever. There we go. This article on Web Design Tuts is a short series of 2 tutorials on building up a sign up and registry form. This is the first part of the series, and it deals purely with the design aspects and sorting that out in Photoshop. And before we jump into the next video, click on that. I have an assignment form for you, as usual. Much in the vein of the last few videos, I'd like you to continue with the PSD file we're building, adding, of course, the contact form. Next time, in 30 days to your first website design, we'll be looking into our footer section. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us here at Tuts Plus, thank you for watching. Hi guys, welcome back to 30 days to your first website design, a Tuts Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to wrap up our PSD design by finishing off our footer. Now we'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. Well, first we'll ask ourselves about the role of footers in web design, and then we'll take a look at a couple of examples before we dive back into our PSD and finish off our own footer. Then, as ever, I'll ask you to complete an assignment before we jump into the next video. Now the footer of any given web page is the bit right at the bottom. That doesn't mean it ranks poorly against other sections of a web page. In fact, studies have shown that in terms of a user's attention span, the footer comes in a close second to the very first bit at the top. And that makes sense too. As we've spoken about, a user will typically scan a web page, not absorb it all in detail. If they're scrolling their way to the bottom of a page past everything else and nothing specifically catches their attention, they're inevitably going to end up at the footer where they're forced to stop and take a look. It's therefore an ideal opportunity to encourage users into taking further action. Designers use footers to display necessary information such as copyright details, but footers are also ideal for housing social links, contact information, newsletter sign-up forms. They can be perfect for reminding users of something you were suggesting in your features area. You can also use a footer to express a final bit of personality before the page ends. You can introduce users to an intriguing fact about your firm. Or how about additional navigation? They can be a way of saying, okay, so you didn't find what you were looking for, try one of these links. Or they can simply be a subtle way of sealing off the rest of your page. Now we're going to opt for the last example in our own design. We don't need our footer to contain much information, we just want to leave some copyright details some subtle yet striking social links. It should complement our design quite nicely. So let's open up our PSD and remind ourselves where we were. Just grab it here. Here we go. Now here we have our footer folder, completely empty and ready to go. So the first thing we're going to need are some social icons. Now they're great. One of the great things about web design is the enormous community that's out there supplying free items and help. So I could recommend you go and check out the icon work by Umar Irshad. Apologies if I didn't say that properly. Here's his dribble page, and these are the icons we're going to grab. We're going to grab them from designmoo.com from their download page. Now once you've grabbed these, you can open up the PSD in Photoshop. They are ideal for our needs. We're not going to use them in their current state, but they're a perfect starting point and they're perfectly scalable too. So let's just auto select group, and we're going to need the Facebook icon, and if I press shift here and select the Twitter and the Skype icons as well, and we can just drag those directly into our layout PSD. So now we can get rid of that altogether. Okay, so that's a good start. I'll bring up my guides here. Actually, I'm just as well getting rid of all the styling on these buttons, I think. So I'm just going to select them all, like so. And I'm going to clear their layer style. Now we'll begin by using the background of one of them, and we're going to sample the pale green, and we're going to do that for the others as well. There we go. The icons themselves we're going to use to match our footer. Oops. There we go. So that's got them styled perfectly. Now all we really need to do is size them properly. So actually they're sized fine anyway. We're going to have them the width of these grids here, so that's ideal actually. All we really need to do is bring them within the right spacing of each other, like so. Let's just zoom in to make sure we're doing this accurately enough. Actually, I'm going to slightly resize them here so that they are exactly the same size as these columns. Okay. And the Twitter one, like so. And by selecting all of them and aligning them along the horizontal axis, should have actually worked. Yeah, oh, that Twitter looks slightly smaller than the rest for some reason. That's interesting. That would suggest I've knocked one of my guides perhaps. Yes, I have. I've knocked this guy by the look of it. That should be there. Okay, that makes more sense. Alright, so I'll zoom out. That's catered for those nicely. Now, as I mentioned before, we could do with making sure that we have our hover state dealt with. So I'm going to select my Twitter background and I'm going to make it a bit brighter. So that's going to be how our hover state appears on our social links. That's perfect. We're going to allow that to have a little bit of padding inside the outer edge of our design. So now all we need to do is add a little bit of text as well. I have some copyright information in a text file here, so I'll just grab that, copy it, and making sure I'm not in one of my icon folders. drag like so, and paste it like so. Now we're going to colour it like so, making it a touch darker, a little subtler. And then I'm going to make a couple of links here just to suggest that there's something that can be done. That's going to be much brighter with an underline. And this one too. There we go. Okay, that's perfectly aligned. Actually, if we just center that against our icons and then move out, let's see how that appears. That seems to have finished off our page quite nicely. Straightforward, but just the job. Okay, so we'll Command and S that, and that just about finishes up our PSD. So in the next video we're going to start looking at preparing this to move into HTML and CSS. Okay, it's time for some further reading, so we'll just jump back into the presentation here. Now this is nothing too heavy, but you might want to take a look at this roundup of inspirational footer designs on Noop.com. That might just give you the ideas you've been looking for. Next time on 30 Days to Your First Website Design, we're going to begin transforming our PSD into working browser magic. We'll take a look at prepping our design. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us at Touch Plus, thanks for watching. Hi guys, welcome back to 30 Days to Your First Website Design, a Touch Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to look at prepping our design. So we'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. Well, first off, we'll look at exactly what I mean by prepping. Then we'll examine our layout PSD and think about the possibilities where images and CSS are concerned. Then, before we jump into the next video, I'll leave you with an assignment. Well, as we're rounding off our design phase, this really is a quick part of the process. In days gone by, when CSS was in the early stages of implementation and designers weren't used to controlling it anyway, websites were constructed with tables. If you're not sure what I mean, I'm certainly not going to drag that story from its grave. Needless to say, it was an horrendous workflow of chopping up tiny bitmap images and using them to decorate and form complex table layouts. Almost every inch of a PSD design required slicing and saving in order to build a web page. Now this made building a design for the web difficult and drawn out, plus altering a design an absolute nightmare. Take a look at this quick example. Yes, there are still examples out there. This is Quality, which is the support team for Xcart e-commerce solution, actually, which is pretty horrendous. That I should find this example on their site. Now I'm in Chrome here, so if I just right click and open my element inspector, you can see here that this whole region is built up of table rows and cells filled with tiny little images everywhere. It's awful. And this is typical of how websites used to be built. Thankfully those days are gone, so we'll just get rid of that. Now with modern techniques, much of what you design in Photoshop can be recreated with CSS alone. Drop shadows, rounded corners, texture backgrounds, to name but a few examples, all help to speed up build time, page load time, and editing time. Of course, older browsers are still in use, so by using modern CSS techniques, you'll have to include fallback options if you want those browsers to render your website correctly. We can compromise, however, and it's therefore up to us to decide which elements of our design can be recreated with CSS and which we'll rely on images for. So let's refer back to our design and analyze how we could prep things. So we'll open up our PSD there. It should be looking very familiar to you by now. Now firstly, there's the background. Our footer is a solid color, so that can be defined with a simple CSS rule. The background texture of the upper section and the darker version of the contact area, they all need to be saved as two small tiles which will repeat across the page. Now there's also the logo, that will of course have to be an image. Then we have the large call to action button. Now that can be recreated without too much difficulty with CSS. A simple red square with completely rounded corners and a slight transparency, plus the symbol used for the arrow, that's all doable. But Internet Explorer can only handle those properties from version 9 onwards. Unless we're prepared to consider a fallback technique, we'll probably have to settle with a straightforward image for this whole thing. Actually, the image itself could be our fallback if we use it only for Internet Explorer 8 or earlier. Our staff images, these thumbnails here, these will be images of course, and the fonts, they will be dealt with web fonts from Google, as we've already discussed. Our map here, that will be provided by a JavaScript snippet from Google Maps, and the send button background along with the three social buttons, they can be, just as with the call to action, built largely with CSS unless we opt to go for images. Now one advantage of using CSS, for example, would be that we could very quickly change the background colors without having to edit and resave any images. Okay, it's time for some further reading, so we'll jump back into our presentation. Now there are several tutorials on web design tuts which discuss the merits of CSS over Photoshop where certain things are concerned, but this series does so very thoroughly. Take a look, and these tutorials will help you work out what can be done in CSS3, which we've traditionally relied on graphics programs for. Now before we jump into the next video, I'd like you to go over our document again and decide for yourself which elements you think would be appropriate for building using CSS and which we should rely on images for. Next time on the 30 days to your first website design, we're going to take this step a bit further and look at CSS sprite sheets. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us at Tuts Plus, thanks for watching. Hi guys, welcome back to 30 days to your first website design, a Tuts Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to talk about sprite sheets. We'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. First, we'll take a look at what sprite sheets are and where they're used. We'll then examine some of the advantages to using them before we build our own sprite sheet from our PSD layout. Lastly, as ever, I'll ask you to complete a small task before we jump into the next video. Now, you'll be familiar with sprite sheets if you're into your computer games, as that's where they originate. A sprite sheet is typically a single bitmap image comprised of a number of graphic assets. In computer games, there'd be a sprite sheet for each element, a character for example, in its various states. If you visit chrome.angrybirds.com and use the inspector to examine the elements, you'll find that the game is built with a large number of sprite sheets. Now, these sheets contain each character in all of the possible states, and it's these sheets which are then used to animate the birds. The same principle can apply to web design. You can place all or a great deal of your graphic elements on one bitmap and then use that sprite sheet to decorate your various elements. You might place background textures, icons, logos, button images on your sprite sheet. Here is an example used by the Next Web. It's a large sparse PNG file containing all the elements you'll recognize from the site. And here's another example which will hopefully be familiar to you. You can clearly see the Web Design Tuts logo, a couple of buttons and icons such as those used on the preview thumbnails to indicate the basics or a premium tutorial. And these sheets are used as the background image for various layout elements. We create the element, determine its dimensions, and then apply the background image, specifying the coordinates on the sheet for the graphic we want to use. We're effectively masking the sheet with our element. So that's what a sprite sheet is, but why would you arrange your graphics like this instead of using a collection of small images? Well, the first advantage is file size. Take a look at the Web Design Tuts sprite for example. Here you can see the whole PNG saved at 41 KB, and then there's a folder with all the composite pieces saved as separate files. they total 78 KB. So even with all the additional white space we have on the sprite sheet, we've halved the cumulative size of the file. And this is just a small example. Your site may have much more in the way of graphics, in which case the saving would be greater still. The second advantage is organizational. It's far preferable to have one file where all your images can be found. It makes for much less messy project folders, and it's quicker if any editing needs to be done. The third and possibly most crucial advantage is faster page loading time. We've already mentioned the file size, so that obviously helps, but combining your graphics into just a few sprite sheets minimizes the HTTP requests the browser has to make when loading your page. When loading, each time your web page requires an asset, a graphic or CSS file, whatever, it makes a call to the web server which sends it back to the browser. There's a limit to how many of these HTTP requests to the same domain can occur simultaneously, so in cases where a lot of assets are needed, you can get a bottleneck forming. By just requesting a single sprite sheet and committing it to the browser's cache, you're saving a ton of load time. Okay, enough talking. Let's get busy and take our own graphic elements to build a sprite sheet for use on our website. So we'll exit our presentation and we'll open up Photoshop and our layout PSD there. Okay, now we discussed in the previous video which of these elements we were likely to take into images and what we were likely to achieve using CSS. So you'll have a good idea of which bits we're going to be using now. So let's start a new file, 1000 by 1000 pixels, just as a large empty canvas to begin with. We'll call it Sprite and we'll click OK to open that. I'd like to see a grid as well because that will be useful for equally spacing out and distributing our elements. Okay, there we go. We'll do it actual size. Okay, we'll start one by one, just selecting and dragging our bits and pieces over. So there's our logo. We can tuck that up in the top corner. We're going to have now a number of these elements we can achieve with images or with CSS. So we could grab them in any case just to go and use in browsers which can't handle any CSS rules we're going to be using, such as rounded corners, for example. That's one option. Or we could have a separate sprite sheet just for Internet Explorer, which would save load time on the browsers which don't need those images. We're going to just make one sprite sheet for the time being, just for the sake of simplicity. So let's take both these buttons. I'll just put those within that grid there, that grid cell. We could do with this whole thing here as well. Oops. Where is it? Okay. I'll drag this one over. And luckily we don't have too much in the way of graphical bits and bobs anyway. I'm just going to give that some more room just in case I'm chopping any of it off here. Actually I could use a little bit of this texture under that, so I'm going to repeat that, making a second copy, place that underneath, and I'm going to apply that pattern to it. If I remember correctly, it had something to do with freckles. Where is it? There we go. Straight away. Bang, got it. Okay. So that's that one done. We didn't need these because these will be separate images. The map we'll have dealt with using JavaScript. It might be a good idea to grab this send button as well, just to be safe. We can achieve that again with CSS, but we'll take that just for browsers that can't handle that. And now I'm going to grab all three of these icon.